Chapter 8 of The Legends of the Jews, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. The Legends of the Jews, Volume 4, by Louis Ginzberg. Chapter 8, Elisha, the disciple of Elijah. The voices of the thousands of prophets of his time were stilled when Elijah was translated from earth to heaven. With him vanished the prophetical spirit of those who in former times had in no wise been his inferiors. Elisha was the only one among them whose prophetical powers were not diminished. On the contrary, they were strengthened as a reward for the unhesitating readiness with which he obeyed Elijah's summons, and parted with the field he was ploughing, and with all else he possessed, in favor of the community. Thenceforward he remained Elijah's unwearying companion. When the angel descended from heaven to take Elijah from earth, he found the two so immersed in a learned discussion that he could not attract their attention, and he had to return his errand unfulfilled. Elijah's promise to bestow a double portion of his wondrous spirit upon his disciple was realized instantaneously. During his life, Elisha performed 16 miracles, and 8 was all his master had performed. The first of them, the crossing of the Jordan, was more remarkable than the corresponding wonder done by Elijah, for Elisha traversed the river alone, and Elijah had been accompanied by Elisha. 2 saints always have more power than one by himself. His second miracle, the healing of the waters of Jericho so that they became fit to drink, resulted in harm to himself, for the people who had earned their livelihood by the sale of wholesome water were very much incensed against the prophet for having spoiled their trade. Elisha, whose prophetic powers enabled him to read both the past and the future of these tradesmen, knew that they, their ancestors, and their posterity had not even the aroma of good about them. Therefore he cursed them. Suddenly a forest sprang up, and the bears that infested it devoured the murmuring traders. The wicked fellows were not undeserving of the punishment they received, yet Elisha was made to undergo a very serious sickness by way of correction for having yielded to passion. In this he resembled his master Elijah. He allowed wrath and zeal to gain the mastery over him. God desired that the 2 great prophets might be purged of this fault. Accordingly, when Elisha rebuked King Jehoram of Israel, the spirit of prophecy forsook him, and he had to resort to artificial means to reawaken it within himself. Like his teacher, Elisha was always ready to help the poor and needy, as witness his sympathy with the widow of one of the sons of the prophets, and the effective aid he extended to her. Her husband had been none other than Obadiah, who, though a prophet, had at the same time been one of the highest officials at the court of the sinful king Ahab. By birth an Edomite, Obadiah had been inspired by God to utter the prophecy against Edom. In his own person he embodied the accusation against Esau, who had lived with his pious parents without following their example, while Obadiah, on the contrary, lived in constant intercourse with the iniquitous king Ahab and his still more iniquitous spouse Jezebel, without yielding to the baneful influence they exercised. This same Obadiah not only used his own fortune, but went to the length of borrowing money on interest from the future king, in order to have the wherewithal to support the prophets who were in hiding. On his death, the king sought to hold the children responsible for the debt of the father. In her despair, the pious wife of Obadiah went to the graveyard, and there she cried out, "O thou God-fearing man!" At once a heavenly voice was heard questioning her. "There are 4 God-fearing men, Abraham, Joseph, Job, and Obadiah. To which of them dost thou desire to speak?" "To him of whom it is said, he feared the Lord greatly." She was led to the grave of the prophet Obadiah, where she poured out the tale of her sorrow. Obadiah told her to take the small remnant of oil she still had to the prophet Elisha and request him to intercede for him with God. For God, he said, is my debtor, seeing that I provided 100 prophets, not only with bread and water, but also with oil to illuminate their hiding place. For do not the Scriptures say, He that hath pity upon the poor lendeth unto the Lord? Forthwith the woman carried out his behest. She went to Elisha, and he helped her by making her little cruse of oil fill vessels upon vessels without number, and when the vessels gave out, she fetched potsherds, saying, May the will that made empty vessels full make broken vessels perfect. So it was. The oil ceased to flow only when the supply of potsherds as well as vessels gave out. In her piety, the woman wanted to pay her tithe offering, but Elisha was of the opinion that as the oil had been bestowed upon her miraculously, she could keep it wholly and entirely for her own use. Furthermore, Elisha reassured her as to the power of the royal princes to do her harm. The God who will close the jaws of the lions set upon Daniel, and who did close the jaws of the dogs in Egypt, the same God will blind the eyes of the sons of Ahab and deafen their ears so that they can do thee no harm. Not only was the poor widow helped out of her difficulties, her descendants unto all times were provided for. The oil rose in price, and it yielded so much profit that they never suffered want. The Shunammite. The great woman of Shunam, the sister of Abishag and wife of the prophet Iddo, also had cause to be deeply grateful to Elisha. When Elisha came to Shunam on his journey through the land of Israel, his holiness made a profound impression upon the Shunammite. Indeed, the prophet's eye was so awe-inspiring that no woman could look him in the face and live. Contrary to the habit of most women who are intent upon diminishing their expenses and their toil, the Shunammite took delight in the privilege of welcoming the prophet to her house as a guest. She observed that not even a fly dared approach close to the holy man, and a grateful fragrance exhaled from his person. If he were not so great a saint, she said, and the holiness of the Lord did not invest him, there were no such pleasant fragrance about him. That he might be undisturbed, she assigned the best chambers in the house to the prophet. He, on his part, desiring to show his appreciation of her hospitality, knew no better return for her kindness than to promise that she should be blessed with a child within a year. The woman protested, "Oh, my husband is an old man, nor am I of an age to bear children. The promise cannot be fulfilled." Yet it happened as the prophet had foretold. Before a 12-month had passed, she was a mother. A few years later, her child died a sudden death. The mother repaired to the prophet and lamented before him, "Oh, that the vessel had remained empty, rather than it should be filled first and then be left void." The prophet admitted that, though as a rule he was acquainted with all things that were to happen, God had left him in the dark about the misfortune that had befallen her. With trusting God, he gave his staff to his disciple Gehazi and sent him to bring the boy back to life. But Gehazi was unworthy of his master. His conduct toward the Shunammite was not becoming a disciple of the prophet, and above all, he had no faith in the possibility of accomplishing the mission entrusted to him. Instead of obeying the behest of Elisha not to speak a word on his way to the child of the Shunammite, Gehazi made sport of the task laid upon him. To whatever man he met he addressed the question, "Dost thou suppose this staff can bring the dead back to life?" The result was that he forfeited the power of executing the errand with which he had been charged. Elisha himself had to perform the miracle. The prophet uttered the prayer, "O Lord of the world, as thou didst wonders through my master Elijah, and didst permit him to bring the dead to life, so I pray thee, do thou perform a wonder through me, and let me restore life to this lad." The prayer was granted, and the child was revived. The act of the prophet proves the duty of gratitude in return for hospitality. Elisha did not attempt to resuscitate his own kith and kin who had been claimed by death. He invoked a miracle for the sake of the woman who had welcomed him kindly to her house. Gehazi. Gehazi proved untrustworthy by his conduct on this occasion, again aroused the ire of the prophet when he disregarded the order not to accept money from Naaman, the Syrian captain. He did not succeed in deceiving the prophet. On his return from Naaman, he found Elisha occupied with the study of the chapter in the Mishnah Shabbat, which deals with the 8 reptiles. The prophet Elisha greeted him with the rebuke, "Thou villain! The time has come for me to be rewarded for the study of the Mishnah about the 8 reptiles. May my reward be that the disease of Naaman afflict thee and thy descendants for evermore." Scarcely had these words escaped his lips when he saw the leprosy come out on Gehazi's face. Gehazi deserved the punishment on account of his base character. He was sensual and envious, and did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. His unworthy qualities were displayed in his conduct toward the Shunammite and toward the disciples of Elisha. When the pretty Shunammite came to the prophet in her grief over the death of her child, Gehazi took her passionately in his arms under the pretext of forcing her away from the prophet, on whom she had laid hold in her supplications. As for the other disciples of Elisha, he endeavored to keep them away from the house of the prophet. He was in the habit of standing without the door. This induced many to turn away and go home, for they reasoned that if the house were not full to overflowing, Gehazi would not be standing outside. Only after Gehazi's dismissal did the disciples of Elisha increase marvelously. That Gehazi had no faith in the resurrection of the dead is shown by his incredulity with regard to the child of the Shunammite. In spite of all these faults, Elisha regretted that he had cast off his disciple, who was a great scholar in the law, especially as Gehazi abandoned himself to a sinful life after leaving the prophet. By means of magnetism, he made the golden calves at Beth-el float in the air, and many were brought to believe in the divinity of these idols. Moreover, he engraved the great and awful name of God in their mouth. Thus they were enabled to speak, and they gave forth the same words God had proclaimed from Sinai, "I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have no other gods before me." Elisha accordingly repaired to Damascus to lead Gehazi back to the paths of righteousness, but he remained impenitent, for he said, "From thyself I have learned that there is no return for him who not only sins himself, but also induces others to sin." So Gehazi died without having done aught to atone for his transgressions, which were so great that he is one of the few Jews who have no share in paradise. His children inherited his leprosy. He and his 3 sons are the 4 leprous men who informed the king of Israel of the precipitate flight of the Syrian host. Elisha's excessive severity toward his servant Gehazi and toward the mocking boys of Jericho did not go unpunished. He had to endure 2 periods of disease, and the 3rd sickness that befell him caused his death. He is the first known to history who survived a sickness. Before him, death had been the inevitable companion of disease. A great miracle marked the end of a life rich in miraculous deeds. A dead man revived at the touch of Elisha's bier and stood on his feet. It was a worthy character for whom the wonder was accomplished. Shallum, the son of Tikvah, the husband of Huldah, the prophetess, a man of noble descent, who had led a life of loving kindness. He was in the habit of going daily beyond the city, bearing the pitcher of water, from which he gave every traveler to drink, a good deed that received a double reward. His wife became a prophetess, and when he died and his funeral, attended by a large concourse of people, was disturbed by the invasion of the Arameans, he was given new life by contact with the bones of Elisha. He lived to have a son, Hanamel by name. The death of Elisha was a great misfortune for the Israelites. So long as he was alive, no Aramean troops entered Palestine. The first invasion by them happened on the day of his burial.